Hi everyone, it's Lynn from the Stitch TV show, another episode of Shop My Stash. Today I thought we would talk just a little bit about how there are not rules around what kinds of fabrics you can put in the same quilt. If you are doing, I've heard people say if you're doing an 1800s reproduction quilt, you can only use 1800s fabric. And I've heard people talk about how they store certain types of fabric all together because it's reproduction. Now, if you're going for that look, yes, you can just use the 1800s reproduction fabric. If you're wanting to do a 1930s, feed sack looking quilt, yes, just use those fabrics. But like those fabrics can be used in any quilt. Batiks don't have to be in a quilt with just batiks. 1800s fabrics doesn't have to be in a quilt with just 1800s. Modern fabric can be used in all kinds of quilts. There's not like rules that say you have to do it a certain way. So what I wanted to show you was a quilt that I've made where I used 1800s fabrics, modern fabrics, and batiks. So I broke all the rules. I think the only one I didn't get into here was a 1930s print, which no worries, I could try that later. So this is, I fell in love with doing these Lone Stars, and I've taught a couple of classes. So when I teach the class, I normally kind of start a quilt that's similar. So I have taught this class a few times. So I've made 4 Lone Stars. I've quilted 2 of them. This is one of the ones I've quilted. So when you make a Lone Star, what you're doing is you're making these blades, right? And you'll notice these blades, and you can do these lots of different ways. But the thing to remember about with a Lone Star quilt is that there is one ring around the Lone Star quilt where the fabric always touches, and that's what they call the blaze ring. So this blaze ring was actually my jumping off fabric. It's the fabric I kind of said, let's start there and see where it goes. And this is a Cave Facet fabric. I like Cave. I have to admit, I kind of have a lot of him in my stash. But you'll notice I went from a Cave Facet fabric, this is Cave Polka Dot, to a batik. Why did I use the batik? Because it worked with that Cave Facet. So I don't care that I'm using a modern type of print with a batik. And then I used a second batik with this is also a batik, but it has a nice, I went from all of these purples, right? And then this is a modern fabric from a modern designer, and I can't tell you who because I don't recognize it right off the top of my head. A good polka dot. You can never go wrong with a good polka dot. I know you've heard me say that. Polka dots and stripes make me happy. All right, so you've got your batiks in here, well, with modern fabrics and Cave Facet, and they work well together. Like, that is a nice look. It has value change. Some of it has really strong edge. Not all of it does. These blend a little bit better than giving me really strong edges. But then when I go down to the other part of my blade, which I flipped them, you can kind of see where the dark's in the center and then the light and then dark in the center here. But so I flipped every other one because I liked how it looked. But you can also see where I did a change of pace. Instead of doing all one color, I wanted to pick up some other colors in here. Now notice this focus fabric really doesn't have some of these oranges in here that strongly. So I decided it should, because orange is good color. There you go. So what I did is I just decided to use green as a jumping off point and then to get me to orange. So how I did that was, this is a modern fabric, and then you've got a really chartreuse green. That gives me a lot of light. Like, this gives me a lot of light, and it also gives me a really strong edge. You can see clearly the difference between this fabric and this fabric, whereas you can't see it as clearly in the purples. Like, it's there, but it's not as strong. So that jump gives me a nice contrast, which pops that edge of that blade. You see how that works? You can see that, and I'm using a light fabric that helps my eye move around the quilt. Again, we've talked about this before. It's really important to give your eye a reason to go around the quilt. And one of the techniques in doing that is using a light fabric, where you're going to have a really great value change, right? So this is a big value change between the ones that are up next to it. Now, here's the deal, guys. That's a reproduction 1800s fabric. But it was the right burnt orange that I needed that picked up a little bit of teeny tiny burnt orange in here, which was really hard to see on the camera, but it picked it up enough and it carried me to that. And then I was able to go into those orangey pinkish colors, salmon colors, right? Which was also picked up in here. Okay? So Kaif hides colors in his fabrics, and that's why they're really interesting to look at. So you can see that this gave me, and this contrast, which is really exciting, has almost a vibration to it. I've heard Gerald Roy talk about it, how it's a plastic look, and it's a vibration that you're getting between that really strong salmon pink against that really deep purple, and it kind of glows. And again, I'm using that to help me move around the quilt. Now notice I did a piano key border, so I took my colors all the way to the border. Random did this, so it gives me another reason to look. So I'm getting these little pops of green every once in a while, which helps your eye move throughout the quilt. And what is really cool, and I really feel strongly about, especially if you're doing a Lone Star quilt, don't pick out your background till your blades are done. Until this blade is completed, don't pick out your background fabric, because you will want to walk around the store and just put the blade up against different fabrics and they will change. I honestly thought this background fabric would be a purple or a lavender color. I tried really hard to get that to work and it didn't. And then I brought in this gray, this is gray polka dot, but because gray is kind of a chameleon color, when you make gray, it can have undertones in different colors in the gray. Like it could have a brown in it, it could have a black in it. So some of the grays will change colors on you. When I put this gray up against this purple, this gray turned purple. It turned like a lavender purple. And it just popped it. It just made it sing for me. So that's why we went with the gray. Now, I will tell you that most of this was in my stash. I did buy the background, but most of this was in my stash of just what I liked. I had this cave facet in here. I had this. I had this. I had it all except for the gray. So just use things that make you happy and just look at how they work with each other, as well as don't set yourself up for any rules that say you cannot use certain types of fabric with other types of fabric. They will work in a quilt. You just have to give them space so that they can work in the quilt. And you'll notice that these batiks work really well within the quilt, as well as this 1800s print. So no rules there, do what you like, but just wanted to give you that tip that it will be successful. You just have to work with it. And like, share, and subscribe. Be sure and check us out on the Stitch TV show. And let us know what Shop Your Stash questions you have. So I'll be happy to answer them and look at other quilts that we've done. Thanks.